The NFL draft is approaching fast, and you have plenty of questions about Jets draft picks and potential Jets draft trades. Today we have a Locked On Jets NFL Draft Mailbag.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, April 13th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, and I thank you for making the show your first listen or your first watch every day. This show is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit that subscribe button. You'll never miss an episode. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today we have our weekly mailbag. Each Wednesday we try to do a mailbag. And unsurprisingly, most of your questions this week are about the NFL draft. So let's begin. Our first question. If Kayvon Thibodeaux is there at 4, do the Jets pick him unless there are big trade offers? Well, this may not be a very good answer because I cannot give you a definitive answer. I think if it's based purely on the film, based purely on football, if Kayvon Thibodeaux is there at 4, that seems like a slam dunk pick. But I've come to realize that scouting in the NFL, especially from the perspective of media and the fans, it's kind of like an iceberg because you only see a little bit of the iceberg. Most of the iceberg is kind of underwater. So we see the athletic testing and we see what the player did on film. And in many cases, it's tough to even get the real film for college, the all-22. So we can see what a player did during games based on the TV angles. But there's so much more that goes into the scouting process that we don't know about. Now, Kayvon Thibodeaux, there are all these rumors about him, about how he's had a bad process. And honestly, like a lot of the stuff that's being said about him, I feel like it's kind of like tabloid stuff that doesn't really make a difference. But the scouting that goes into a player like this is much more detailed. And there's a lot these teams know about these players that we don't know. And when I talk about this, I think about my old friend Dave T. Thomas. And if you're new to the podcast, we used to have this guy, Dave T. Thomas. He was a scout in professional football for like 5 decades. He had worked in multiple different leagues. Like half the NFL was using him as a consultant. He was just the greatest guest you could ever have. And if you're a longtime listener, you remember Dave T probably because he was a memorable guest. He was a great personality, just a great guy. Very sadly passed away about a year and a half ago. But I always think about like my interactions with him, and like I sent him an email like before a college football Saturday. I'd say, do you have any good prospects you think the Jets would be interested in? And Dave T would send me these like 25-page scouting reports on some like 5th round corner prospect. And it went into incredible degrees of detail. And you learn things that like you would have no other way of knowing because these scouts talk to like everybody who's been close to these players. They talk to like their high school coaches. They talk to, the college coach. They talk to the guys who work at the school. And you get a fuller picture of what these players are about. And sometimes like a guy was having a bad season and I'd read like one of these Dave T scouting reports and you realize that after speaking with the coaches, the scout learns that this guy's playing hurt. That's the reason he's not producing, but he's helping the team out by playing hurt, even though he's hurting his own draft stock. And that's the kind of guy you want. So, the stuff with Thibodeaux, I mean, some of this stuff, again, it doesn't really make a difference to me, all this media stuff. But there are questions with any prospect, and this is not just Thibodeaux, this is any prospect. We're talking Thibodeaux now because the question was about him and because, there are rumors he's had a bad process. But there are things like, are you going to work hard enough to succeed in the NFL? A guy like Ja'Kai Polite obviously really did not. That was a guy the Jets drafted in the 3rd round a couple of years ago. Did not make it out of his first training camp. Guy who had 1st round buzz at the beginning of the process. Fell to the 3rd round. Jets probably were the only team that was even willing to pick him that high because he didn't even make a 53-man roster after the Jets cut him in his first training camp. In the NFL, you got to be able to work. You got to work. Everybody's good in the NFL. In the college, you can coast by on pure talent because there are many games where you're just going to be in such a talent mismatch if you have physical talent that you can dominate without work. You got to be able to work in the NFL. You got to be coachable. You got to be a good fit for the locker room. And another thing I think people forget is you got to fit the system. You got to fit the role the team wants you to play because we talk about these positions generically. We talk about wide receiver. We talk about edge rusher. But different teams ask different players who nominally play the same position to do different things. And a player who may be a good fit for one team may not be a good fit for another. There's also the question of what you have in place. If a player that you draft in the first round is going to be a backup, that pick may not be worth it. Now, I think year one, you can argue a first-round pick, even in year one, could probably sit because you don't really bank on getting a lot of production from rookies. But by year two, you really have to be a starter. It doesn't really make a lot of sense in most cases to draft a guy who's going to be a backup. So there's all this stuff that goes into it. There's so much more that goes into it. And I don't like to speak about things that I don't know about. I don't like to pretend I'm an expert about things that I really don't know about. And I know some wise guy out there is going to be like, well, you pretend you're an expert about the Jets. Yeah, good one. That's really funny, really original. But listen, I don't know any of this off-field stuff. Really, anybody who acts like they do is speculating. And in all honesty, a lot of the stuff is kind of subjective. Stuff that bothers one team may not bother another team. So without knowing this stuff and without knowing what the Jets' threshold is, I can't tell you definitively whether or not Thibodeaux would be the pick for the Jets. And I think anybody who acts like they could is just guessing. So I don't like to guess on things like this. I'll say this. Based on football, based on what we've seen from the footage, it seems like it would be kind of a slam dunk pick, though, because first of all, the Jets have that void at defensive end that they got to fill. And, Franklin Myers, we don't really know whether he's going to be inside at defensive tackle or outside at defensive end. But they need a guy to go across from Carl Lawson. And if we're going to be honest, I don't think Carl Lawson's exactly a slam dunk this year. I think whenever you lose a guy for a full season, on some level, I think the Jets are expecting big things from Carl Lawson, but on some level, you got to have some degree of concern. So the defensive end like Thibodeaux falling to you at 4 when for most of the season before all of this pre-draft stuff started, he was kind of the consensus number 1 overall pick that maybe fell to, maybe he was like 1A with Hutchison near the end of the year. It seems like it would make sense. But a lot of this is going to go into the stuff we don't see, the part of the iceberg that's underwater in the scouting process. So I can't tell you definitively whether or not. I'll say if he doesn't go, then you know that it's not about football. It's about some of the other stuff. It's about some of the other stuff that is rising as concerns during this process. So I guess that's the best way I can answer that. Is if everything checks out, he's good enough to take it 4 overall. But the other stuff we don't really know about. Next question. This is an interesting one. I've been toying with the idea of drafting 2 edge rushers in the first round and really attempting to make the pass rush a dominant unit for years to come. It would depend on how the board falls or trade back scenarios, but what would you think of walking away with 2 edge rushers early if it matches getting the top end talent and difference makers? And I think first of all, it's always a question of where the board falls, because I don't think you can try and force something. I think that leads to mistakes. But my mindset, there are lots of team building mindsets I believe in. One of the things I believe in is that you can never have too many pass rushers. Whenever somebody says, especially with the Jets, who have never had good pass rushers in 2 decades, when somebody says, well, we don't really need a pass, you always need another pass rusher. You always, always, always need another pass rusher. And I can go through teams that won championships who had that mindset. You always need another pass rusher. You always need. I'm going to repeat it over and over and over and over again just to make the point, because pass rushing in this league is such a valuable commodity. So in that sense, it's not a bad move. And this kind of goes to what I was talking about yesterday. I was talking about some of some of the more abstract needs the Jets have, and one of them I talked about was the lack of a unit that really dominates, the lack of a unit that really strikes fear into the heart of the opposition. And there's no better place on defense. You could argue corner, but I don't think there's any better place on defense to build a dominant unit than your pass rush. Guys who can get after the quarterback. When you have a good pass rush, it just makes everything easier. It makes everything better. And you turn those long downs and distances into a bad scenario. When you got a lead, especially through the years, and we've seen this over and over, how many times have the Jets failed to hold a late lead in the fourth quarter of a game? Part of that's been the lack of a pass rush, because the other teams had to throw it. If you have a ferocious pass rush, you have a better opportunity to close out those games. So from these standpoints, I think it's a good move. There's another standpoint, though, and again, what I talked about yesterday are kind of competing values, because I talked about the need to support Zach Wilson, which I think is probably a need before anything else. And to me, based on where the Jets are, unless they're able to pull off a surprise trade here, they almost have to draft a receiver with one of these first-round picks, because this offense just isn't good enough, and you're not putting Zach Wilson in a position to succeed. So, and I hate being in this position because I always say, when you go into the draft saying, I need to draft a player at this position, that leads to mistakes. But it's an area, it's what the Jets find themselves in right now. And that's based on how they've handled this offseason. It's based on them. It's a little bit of bad luck, a little bit of perhaps mishandling of the offseason. And it raises the risk level. It raises the risk that you miss out on a great player at another position. It raises the risk that the pool, you're drafting, if you're going in saying we have to draft a player at this position, the pool of players you're picking is much smaller, which raises the odds of you missing. But these are just risks I think the Jets kind of have to take right now. So, I mean, I don't hate the idea in the abstract. I don't hate the idea of loading up on pass rushers, even if, not everybody's going to play the field be on the field full time. I don't think it's that bad of an idea as others might make it out to be, because a good pass rush on defense hides a lot of flaws. But the problem is that the bigger priority for this team, above even building the pass rush, above even creating an area that can overwhelm the opposition, to me, the biggest priority is supporting Zach Wilson, because everything's riding on Zach Wilson. If Zach Wilson does not succeed in his development as an NFL quarterback, the rest of this doesn't really matter. So they need to do everything in their power, and they really haven't this offseason. I don't think they've done a good enough job. I don't want to be in a position where I have to draft a receiver in the first round, but that's the position you're in if you're the Jets right now, I think. So I think it's a tough spot, but I think it's the spot the Jets find themselves in. So we've talked about some players the Jets could draft in the first round, but of course, with a pair of top 10 picks, there's going to be plenty of speculation about potential trades. And I'll give you my thoughts on some of these potential trades ahead here on this Wednesday episode of Locked On Jets. Spring is here, but summer is right around the corner. That means Jets training camp. And if you're going out to camp this year, you want to make sure you have a good pair of sunglasses, because that summer sun gets very bright. And you should know that Shady Rays is an independent sunglass company that gives you the features of $200 sunglasses for a fraction of the price. That means polarized lenses, well-constructed durable frames, and premium high-end finishes. Also, something you won't find anywhere else is Shady Rays' Insane Protection Program. Shady Rays includes lost and broken protection on every pair. They'll send you a brand new pair if you lose them, no matter what happened, and you'll pay nothing. Give them a try, and if you don't love them, you'll pay nothing. It's as simple as that. Plus, 10 meals are donated to fight hunger in America when you shop with Shady Rays. Exclusively for our listeners, head to shadyrays.com and use code LOCKEDON to get 50% off 2 or more pairs of polarized sunglasses. Again, that's code LOCKEDON. It's one word with no space, LOCKEDON, for their best deal of the season. 50% off 2 or more pairs of Shady Rays sunglasses, backed by over 150 verified 5-star reviews. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms. We continue our weekly mailbag. Our next question. I've read a ton of analyses that say the strength of this draft is the late first to early second round. If that's the case, and Detroit wants to trade up for a quarterback to 10, would you trade that pick to the Lions for picks 32 and 34 and whatever mid-late to late round picks are needed to balance it from a trade chart perspective? Well, I have two different answers to this. And this goes back to an article I actually wrote a few weeks ago. And the article wasn't particularly about the Jets-Lions trade. It was more about the concept of trading picks for a wide receiver, because one of the things that interested me was that the Jets made an offer for Tyreek Hill that involved 2 early second-round picks and a third-round pick. And if you look at the trade value chart the teams use, those picks combined were about equal in value to the Jets' 10th overall pick. So my question was, are these picks really equal in value? Because if you look at the points, you'd say yes, 35 plus 38 plus 69 are about equal in value to 10. And then I looked through the actual history of the last 25 years of these picks. And it became clear looking at both the star level of players, talking about Pro Bowls, all-pro teams, and just the overall quality, looking at the number of years players started for their respective teams after being drafted. 35, 38, and 69 were far more valuable than 10. And these picks are roughly in the same neighborhood, talking 32, 34 instead of 35, 38. So, and then the Lions would probably have to throw in maybe another late day 2, early day 3 pick or 2 to balance the trade out. But based on the research I've done, there's not really much doubt that that would be a deal worth making for the Jets. But you also have to consider the way teams make deals in the NFL. And you look at comparable deals, whether it was, Kansas City moving up in 2017 for Mahomes, or similar moves where teams moved up from a quarterback for a quarterback. And you look at like the range of the picks the Jets are in between like 8 to 10 to 12. When teams are moving up for a quarterback, typically they have to give up a future first round pick with that. That was true last year when the Bears moved up for Justin Fields, and the Bears were not moving up from 32. They were moving up from much higher. They were moving up from around 20 when they made that trade with the Giants. So the Lions would be moving up even further for a quarterback. So it's one of those situations that I don't think there's a clear answer, because on balance, our pick 32 plus 34 plus whatever else Detroit would have to throw in, those are probably more valuable on their own than pick 10. So if it came down to it and Detroit said this is our final offer, it probably would be worth taking that offer for the Jets. At the same time, however, looking at recent history, the Jets are in a position where they should be able to demand more, because if you're moving up for a quarterback to pick 10, you ought to be able to, you ought to say, well, hey, if this is your quarterback, this guy's clearly worth next year's first round pick. So I feel like on one hand, the Jets should be able to get more for it. On the other hand, if they can't, I think you take that deal. But the other aspect of this is, like, if Detroit's willing to take a quarterback at 10, they're probably willing to take the quarterback at 2. So this could end up being a moot point, because there's not really that big of a difference between 10. Like, if you're right there at 2, you can just take the guy right there and not have to worry about whether you can work out a deal or trying to negotiate with the Jets and worry that the Jets are going to demand too much in a return. So if a quarterback, and if you look, this isn't like a guy fell to the second round and you're saying, let's just take a shot on him. If you're moving up to 10 for a quarterback, that probably means you have a pretty strong belief in him. So I feel like if you're willing to take the quarterback at 10, you're probably willing to take the quarterback at 2, which makes me feel like, Detroit's probably not going to be the Jets' trading partner here if the Jets are looking to move down from 10 in the NFL draft. Our next question, John, if the Saints offered both of their first-round picks for number 4 overall, would you pull the trigger? So this was actually the topic of a show I did last week, so I'll give you the summary version. I went into great detail on that show, so if you want to hear my in-depth thoughts, I'll give them to you on that show. But much like I did with these with the second and third round picks, I compared the history of pick 4 and the history of the Saints' 2 first round picks, 16-19, over the last 25 years to see which one's more valuable. And what I found was, essentially, if you're looking for an elite player, your odds are roughly equal. Now, your odds are better of finding an elite player at 4 than they are at 16. And your odds of finding an elite player, and I'm talking like all pros, Pro Bowls, your odds are better at 4 than they are at 19. But you have to remember, with the Saints package, you get 2 shots at it. You get 2 shots in the top 20. So your odds of finding an elite player are roughly equal. But with the Saints' 2 picks, the odds are much better at finding 2 guys who are at least going to be really solid for you. So maybe the expected outcome with 4 would be you're hoping to find a star. Whereas with the Saints' 2 picks, 16-19, you can find 1 star and 1 guy who's going to be really solid for you going forward. And that's the difference. And for a team right now with the Jets that just need so much, where you lack depth, where you lack quality across your roster, adding an extra player is when you're not decreasing your odds of finding a great player. Because, again, you got 2 shots. You got 2 swings of the bat here. Even if each individual pick gives you lower odds than just 4, with 2 swings of the bat, you probably have about equal odds of finding a great player. But in addition to finding that great player, you have the ability to find somebody who could be really solid, just a regular starter who does a really solid job for you. And that has a lot of value for a team like the Jets, because Jets need a lot. I see a lot of people say the Jets need elite talent, which they do. Jets need a lot of other stuff too, though. And the other thing about the draft's a very imprecise science. I always think you're better off to give yourselves as many swings of the bat as possible, because it's really tough to draft effectively. I just think this through. Like, think about if you've graduated college and you've been out 5-10 years, could you have predicted what was to come the last the 5 years after you got out of college, the 10 years after you got out of college? There are some things you could have predicted, but there were lots of things you probably did not foresee. And that's the thing. Like the NFL, when you draft a player, there are lots of things you can't predict. I mean, you don't know if somebody's going to get hurt. There have been plenty of guys who probably could have been really good picks through history who've just suffered injuries. Or maybe there's a coaching change you're not expecting and the player doesn't fit your system. And you may just have disevaluated a player. I mean, that happens a lot too. The best talent evaluators have terrible picks. The example I always use is Bobby Beathard. This is an executive who's in the Hall of Fame. He was the GM who picked Ryan Leaf. This was a Hall of Famer who picked Ryan Leaf. So you always have there's always a chance you're going to miss. So in general, I think that you're better off when you give yourself multiple chances. I'm not saying like you trade like the 10th overall pick for 3 fifth round picks. That would be ridiculous, because at some point the quality does drop off enough in the draft that adding an extra pick or two doesn't really make that much of a difference for you. But I will almost always take 2 first-round picks over 1 first-round pick, even if those 2 first-round picks are quite a bit lower, because there's still quality throughout the first round of the NFL draft. I compare it to other sports like basketball. Basketball, you get to around pick 10, and you're pretty much just in the luck portion of the draft. In football, the luck portion of the draft, I think probably begins, based on my research, probably begins around, I don't know, somewhere in the mid to late 4th round. Prior to that, your odds drop a lot in the 2nd round. Your odds drop even further in the 3rd round, even further in the 4th round. But you still have a reasonable shot at getting a good player up until like maybe the mid to late 4th rounds. So adding extra picks, to me, is almost always a really solid strategy. Now, as we close things out on the Locked On Jets podcast, I'll give my thoughts on perhaps the Jets going to a position with one of their early picks that doesn't have a lot of value. And I may have a surprising take on that. You'll hear that ahead here on this Mailbag Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. Of course, we're talking about the NFL draft, which is upcoming in a few weeks. The Jets will hopefully add some great players, but I can tell you, if there was ever a draft for protein bars, there's no question Built Bar would go number 1 overall. The only question is which Built Bar flavor would go first, because there are so many delicious flavors, from mint brownie to coconut almond, white chocolate cookies and cream. The thing is, these are protein bars. They don't taste like them, though. At Built Bar, they figure out how to make it delicious first, and then they figure out how to make it healthy. And I don't know how they do it, but they always accomplish their goal, because, as I said, the bars are covered in 100% real chocolate, but most bars only contain 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Compare that to a candy bar, which usually has around 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. So go to Built.com now and use promo code LOCKED15. If you do that, you'll get 15% off your order. Again, it's promo code LOCKED15. It's one word with no space, LOCKED, number 1, number 5, for 15% off at Built, BUILT.com. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Mailbag Wednesday. Our next question: would you take Breece Hall, the running back out of Iowa State, in the 2nd round to pair up with Michael Carter in the backfield? The big boards are all over the map for all positions, including the 1st round. This is not the deepest receiver class, and the Jets are a team devoid of weapons. So would it make sense to add a premium running back like Breece Hall? Now, if you follow this show through the years, you know that I am Mr. Do not put too many resources into the running back position. So you may be surprised with what I have to say right here, but I would not object to drafting Breece Hall early in the 2nd round for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think he's going to be a really good back in this league. It's not like you're drafting him in the top 10. Second of all, I think he's got the potential to be a home run hitter, and you need as many playmakers as possible on offense. The third reason is that the Jets have a few extra picks this year. So I feel like when you have a couple extra swings of the bat, you can roll the dice on, a position that maybe isn't as valuable as the premium positions in this league, because we all know running back's a position that's been completely devalued through the years in this league. And you got to draft a great running back if it's an early pick, or else it's not really a successful pick. And so you're really swinging for the fences when you do something like that. I feel like you have the luxury of swinging for the fences with multiple 1st round picks and multiple 2nd round picks, maybe more than you would if you just had a normal assortment of draft picks. And beyond that, the receiver position, again, I go back to it, it's not great. And I don't love the idea that you're going to fix everything through rookies. I think it's a lot to ask. I think these rookies could potentially be really good on day 1, but I'd never like to ask a rookie receiver to be good on day 1. Whereas a rookie running back, I think, can contribute. I have more confidence in a rookie running back because there's less nuance at the running back position. At receiver, you have to run routes effectively. You have to beat coverages. I always think that there's an easier transition for the guy who just has the ball in his hands, because you can either make a play or you can't. And that's not something that really changes that much through the course of your NFL career. You can either make a guy miss with the ball in your hands or you can't. A release off the line of scrimmage, that's something that's nuanced. That's something you learn over time. running the ball is running the ball. And, running the ball year one is not that different from running the ball in year two. And based on the receiver position for the Jets, the issues that they have there, perhaps this is a team that's best off just trying to establish the run. And maybe that's the way you take pressure off Zach Wilson. And a running back like Breece Hall could really help on that end. And, another point that I make is I always see people say, you need a power back to pair with Michael Carter. I'm not sure that that's the case. Carter's a little small on the small side for a running back, but I've gone through the numbers and small sample size, but he was good in pretty much any situation I would consider a power situation last year. At least in the areas where he was either great at depending on the situation, he was either great or he was okay. So even if Michael Carter's not the greatest power back in the league, I don't think that's the area where the Jets are lacking. I think the Jets are lacking the home run hitter, and I think that could be Breece Hall. So I don't know if he's even going to make it, because I'm not convinced completely that Breece Hall's making it to 35, but if he's there, it's maybe funny coming from me as, Mr. Don't use too many resources on a running back. This might be the case where just things are lining up where it actually could make sense for the Jets to draft a running back early. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. That's all for today's show, however. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, if you enjoy this show, subscribe to it. Leave it a 5-star review if you're listening on a podcast source. Big thumbs up if you're on YouTube. It helps other Jets fans find the channel. Hope you have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.